All right, let's get back into panel mode. Who wants another panel? I can't hear you. Who wants another panel? All right, that was pretty cool. I want to make sure I get everyone's last name right. This is my biggest fear in life, that I can mispronounce a last name. This panel is very literally called Innovation is Everywhere, right? Innovation everywhere. Now, by way of a little joke, when I was a gentleman who was employed by an investment bank, we had a video that used to play in our office that said innovation is everywhere, and we thought it was like the beginning of a horror movie. Like, what is innovation? Isn't this terrifying? But now we've come to embrace it across the board, and I want to define it, and I want to chat about it. So please give a warm round of applause for our guests. Come on down, everyone. Dina, Samra, Director of Corporate Innovation at GAN. Olivia O'Sullivan, keep clapping, come on, come on. Olivia, Head of Innovation Lab, Vanke Industry and Urban Development. Deborah Zajac of Touchdown Ventures, and Allison Schneider, the Head of Ecosystem Partnerships at E-Trade. All right, come on, please. We want to hear those claps. More. That's right. That's the excitement we want, Mr. Lim. All right, and then I'm going to ask the boring technical questions. Is everybody mic'd up correctly? We all have the right, they can all grab their own mics? Talking to myself. Okay. Please, just going down the line, a twofold first question. Who are you and what do you do? And then how did you get involved in the startup ecosystem, the New York startup ecosystem? You know, how did you, I guess, take the long and winding road that led you here to the Cella Summit?
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. My name is Olivia O'Sullivan. I head up corporate engagement at Acceleprise. If you missed Nina's lovely intro about us earlier, we are a pre-seed B2B SaaS accelerator and seed fund. We're headquartered out in San Francisco and running a program here in New York, opening in Toronto in January. So any Canadians out there?
Go Raptors. We're supposed to say that all day. Have you noticed that every time? Yeah.
I moved to New York 2.5 years ago, followed this phenomenal woman that I was doing business strategy with at McDonald's, went over to Dow Jones to launch their strategic services department, which is just a fancy way of saying business consulting. So I worked with enterprise tech and financial services clients to help them be more innovative. I know, Dow Jones, what? But in that world, then moved over to doing product and innovation strategy, where I got more embedded kind of with the tech and startup ecosystem here, and met my lovely partner, Nina, where she kind of pulled me into the accelerator world. And now here we are at Cella. So, yeah.
Awesome.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Deborah Zajac, and I'm with Touchdown Ventures. We partner with leading corporations to establish and then run their corporate venture capital funds. And we're based in Philadelphia, San Fran, and LA. Naturally, we spend plenty of time here in New York. How I was first introduced to the New York tech ecosystem, it's funny, I think back when I was first introduced in the mid-aughts when I was an MBA student at NYU Stern, we were first forming an entrepreneurship club, and frankly, kind of being out and about in New York and outside of New York, found that it was almost a little bit of a joke at the time to people in other ecosystems in Boston and in the Valley, because they were kind of laughing, like, does New York have an ecosystem? It was still, a little bit in shambles after the dot-com crash. People were still shell-shocked and licking their wounds a bit. And so while there was absolutely an ecosystem at the time, it was a very different place than what you see here today. And it's still amazing to me how quickly it's grown. And I look at that, and when I look around at other ecosystems, that with hope as to what other geographies can grow in a short matter of time.
Hey everyone, nice to meet you. I'm really happy to be here. So Director of Corporate Innovation at GAN, which stands for the Global Accelerator Network. So what the Global Accelerator Network is we are a curated community of accelerators, investors, partners, and studios. So essentially we work with over 120 accelerators globally. They're part of the network. We have access to over 400 different VC firms that also kind of get plugged in that way. We work with, who else? Studio, we have about 40 startup studios studios that are under the network as well. And basically, we just want to make sure that startups succeed. And the way that we look at it is if we can bring all these different startup support organizations together, then we can all work together to be able to support the underdog, which is the startup at the end of the day. So we have access to around 15,000 startups that have already been through an accelerator program or are currently going through one. So a lot of my work is specifically focused around matchmaking between larger corporate entities who are looking for deal flow, investments, in just like an easy and quick and efficient way, essentially. My kind of story, as I've been in the accelerator space for quite some time. I originally was working at Mass Challenge up in Boston for the past 6 years, running their partnerships department, and now moved to New York, obviously, because New York is better than Boston. Don't kill me, anyone. Sorry, but that's the truth. New Yorker at heart. So wanted
when
to
you
move
say
back.
something like that, just say duck, and we'll all handle it. Yeah.
Like I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Can't say that over there. Moved back to New York, and it's been really interesting to actually navigate the scene, and especially as someone that's kind of newer coming into the space. Obviously, John has been super helpful, and I think he's been helpful to everyone probably here in some way, shape, or form. So great resource to have, of course. But I've noticed that I think the New York tech scene in general just seems to be just a little bit more kind of like fragmented than what it was in Boston, and so there isn't kind of like one unifying thing that brings together all the different sectors. Like I think everyone's kind of there's the hardware people and there's the food tech people and there's and there isn't really something that like unifies everyone, and so that's kind of something that I'm still looking for in New York. And I don't know if you guys agree with me in that, but it's just something I've noticed. So yeah.
Hey everyone, is this on? Hi, so I'm Schneider. So I am with E-Trade Financial Services. For those of you who don't know E-Trade or our kind of snarky commercials, we are an online brokerage and financial services firm. I like to refer to us as the OG fintech company. And so I am a part of the innovation lab at E-Trade. We're about a year old, so we've been there since the beginning. And I manage our ecosystem. And it's actually really refreshing to be in a room with people who understand what that is, because one of the first things that I had to do when I came into E-Trade was to even explain to people what an ecosystem was and why it's important that we need to engage the tech ecosystem specifically here in New York and in the other cities where we have presence. So at the end of the day, the way I think about myself is I'm an advocate for startups that want to work with E-Trade, particularly on projects that we're working with within our lab. So I got introduced actually to the ecosystem back when I was working at IBM years ago. I was in different business development and sales roles there, and my last role was actually working with a program called the Watson Ecosystem. So I was working with startups that were building off of the Watson AI APIs. Got the itch to go to a startup myself, spent the past few years working on an AI startup here in New York called X.AI. And then decided to go over to the dark side, to the corporate innovation side, thinking that my perspective being on the startup side, where I was not very bullish on working with innovation teams, would probably be helpful in my role and making it a little bit more collaborative. So that's me.
So Allie, we'll start with you, because you just said the dark side. Is corporate innovation an oxymoron?
No, I honestly don't think so, because I think at the end of the day, if a corporate's going to survive, we have to reinvent ourselves so that we literally don't die. So I think IBM's actually a fantastic example. I mean, the company has been around since 1911. So, they certainly weren't selling mainframes and cloud computing in 1911. They, invented the punch card technology and ATM and different meat slicing machines.
The original international business machine was a horse. Thank you.
But truly, a company doesn't exist that as long as a company like that has if they don't reinvent themselves. So I think it's not a matter of if. I think you either stagnate and you say we're just going to sit here and wait until someone disrupts us or our industry or our market's disrupted, or we're going to be proactive and we're going to go on the offense.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you said. I don't think it's an oxymoron. I do think that, it's not easy to innovate, and I think a lot of the times it's because of stupid bureaucracy, to be honest, that people can't get shit done, right? So I think that it's kind of like this tug of war, right? Like push and pull type of thing where there's a lot of people that do want to push a certain company forward and actually help them, and that there's a lot of people that are like, well, we've been doing this since 1911 and we've made a lot of money, so why do we have to do it? So I think it's always going to be like that, I think, until you start to actually see real world examples of like successes and outcomes of good startup corporate collaborations. Because right now it's like there's definitely a lot, but there's still room to grow, I think.
And something I think we see a lot as well is innovation is happening in silos in large enterprise companies. So there might be one business unit or a lab or a certain group of people that are doing a phenomenal job at being able to move quickly, tap into resources, go out to ecosystem partners or do entrepreneurship, but it's not something that we're seeing across a whole business. So for us, a lot of times we'll come in and say, great, what's actually really helpful is just being able to bring all these business unit heads together to have a collaborative conversation and say, hey, what are we seeing? What are our customers saying? What's happening in the market? Where do we need to be more innovative, and how can we move the needle when we're working together collaboratively? Not necessarily saying that there's an innovation problem, but that it's happening in these pockets and not spread across the entire organization.
And I think actually these conversations can be helpful. We also do that as part of our work at Touchdown Ventures. But I think actually those pockets exist for good reason. Sometimes I think that if you're a corporate innovation professional, maybe you should come with a tagline of, don't try this at home, this is for professionals only. And part of it is because it takes training, practice, and time, but what it also takes is the right kind of structure. Yeah. Inside of a corporation.
Interesting.
Because if you think about it, look, out there in the world, you get what you measure. But on top of that, inside of a corporation and inside of that world, every organization and function has its own structure, processes, expected outcomes, ways of working, and measures of success. And so if left in a vacuum, if you just say, oh, we're all going to innovate, but we're not going to think about innovation differently, and put this infrastructure around it and this different thinking around it differently, you're probably setting yourself up for failure because you haven't given it the right tools and given the people the right tools to be successful. And so it is a different language, it's a different methodology process, and those who recognize that and kind of give people room to breathe, I think have a chance for better success in the end.
Let's stay with that for a moment, because I want to know what each of you all do to actually foster these startup corporate relationships you've been talking about. Like, is it a lab? Is it a fund? Because, and again, we'll stay with you, Deborah. We'll start, and then sort of anyone can answer. But if there's value in having these business units siloed, if there's value in everyone kind of doing their own best innovation method, what are the ones that you've seen that are most successful?
It's a great question, and I'd invite others to jump in on that. I nerded out on this early back when I'd started out actually at a .com startup in the Boston ecosystem, and then eventually found my way. And I was thinking a lot about corporate entrepreneurship and other types of innovation, as well as working with outside startups. And so read a ton of books and lots of literature, and I think I go back to 3M and Xerox PARC and all kinds of classic examples, and there's been so many other examples since. I think there's not one model. One thing that we like to do at Touchdown is actually think about that, learn the corporation, understand the culture, and think about what ingredients, it kind of again like a toolbox, if you will, what tools or what ingredients may work well here at this time in this way.
But
so not one recipe.
Push back for 1 second.
Okay.
Sorry, because I do want to hear, but I know that we've all heard that a lot, and while I personally and from my own experience happen to agree, there's also the challenge where some of this is proprietary work. The nature of corporations doesn't always lend itself for leaving the blueprint right out. So yes, it's all a toolkit, but how frequently are corporations actually saying, hey, come play with our toolkit? How much they off, is 3M then saying to IBM, to any other company, hey, we want to share best practices? I don't know. I've seen great examples of that, and also I've seen examples where people kind of stay safe in their silo and don't open up because it's a new way of working. So if anyone wants to field that.
I think we see people interested in sharing best practices because a lot of companies feel like they're just dipping their toe into the world of corporate innovation and they're interested in learning from people who have done it previously. I don't think, in terms of behind the curtain, how much information they're giving for that. But I think similarly to Touchdown, we think of it more as a consultative approach. So I think there's certain groups that we feel like there's more success initially talking to. I think to Allison's point, when you have someone who you're like, oh, you get this, it's easier to have a conversation with, someone who's doing emerging technology stuff or has been involved in this ecosystem previously, to kind of ignite that conversation. But there's so many different vehicles for innovation and, best practices that work across different organizations. So for us, a lot of it is getting to know the partner, deeply understanding what their needs are, the challenges that they're having, and then figuring out how we can kind of support those goals.
Allie, maybe we can go back to this end of the conversation. What is innovation theater?
I really love, what was the Silicon Valley petting zoo? Yeah. That is another really good one. I think innovation theater is looking like you're trying to be innovative. I don't think anybody should set out with the goal of trying to do innovation theater. But it's been interesting actually setting up the lab within E-Trade, because when you're starting from scratch, you have to kind of start small, which someone coming from the startup side can be a little bit frustrating from a pace perspective. But you have to start somewhere. And so I think some of the activities that seem a little bit more, marketing based, right? Hosting events, hosting meetups, going to conferences, just having a general presence. That stuff is still important because that's how you're starting to, insert yourself into that community. With that being said, I think it needs to be done in a really thoughtful way, right? You don't want to be throwing money and logos and people everywhere. I think you really want to take a long, hard look and say, what are the communities that we want to be actively present in and just be in and start talking to people and learning and understanding. So I don't know if I would call that innovation theater as much as kind of your own kind of innovation education as you're getting started, but I think there is something to it. With that being said, the thing that I see a lot and that I try to be really cognizant of at E-Trade, because I saw it a lot on the startup side, is you get a lot of companies that just want to meet with startups, and there are actually corporate innovation teams that measure their own success based on how many startups they talk to in a month or in a quarter. And that, especially coming from the startup side, that's the most frustrating thing in the world. You don't have unlimited time and unlimited resources to be a shiny penny in every room that you walk into. And so that's something we really try to be is very sensitive to that. Where we have interests, where we have resources, where we have budget, and where we don't. And I think honesty is a big part of that, assessing your own internal readiness.
Allison, I think something you just said really resonated with me, because one thing I've seen is that innovation theater seems to happen if not everybody is very clear on the impact. Why are we doing what we're doing? And if that's not clear and it's not also communicated, it can start to look like that, or maybe at times feel like that. And so it's actually hard. There's, speaking from the corporate investment side, we look at financial returns and strategic returns. Financial returns, a little bit easier to measure, whether it's in corporate commercial relationships or actual returns. Strategic is not easy to measure, but is possible. And it sounded like some of these people were saying, can we try to measure it by looking at the volume of startup conversations? I think they were making an attempt. And it's good to make those attempts. It's good to be thoughtful, because at the end of the day, if you think about why are we doing this from the beginning, you can think about, well, what does success look like? Create that shared vision, and then everybody kind of gets it. And then the theater starts to fall away a little bit, because those other activities you could be doing become a distraction from your main goal.
I think it's really important to also just be really clear with your expectations and what you're here to do. You guys are really good at that. Very, very clear and open and honest with entrepreneurs. And I think that's where things start to get messy, when, people parade in entrepreneurs for a demo day and then nothing actually comes out of it for the entrepreneurs. That's frustrating, for entrepreneurs, as we all know, time equals death, right? So it can be really frustrating on the startup side. And But at the end of the day, the startup knows that they need the corporate in order to be successful, and they need their resources, so they keep taking these meetings. And then it's just frustration on both sides. So I think that my advice to someone, on the corporate side is probably, just be really, really open and honest of like, hey, listen, you're not going to hear from us in 9 months, by the way. You're not actually, we're not even investing, and this is still super early stage, but we're really interested in what you're doing.
And I'm quitting to go be an entrepreneur.
Right,
like
and
you,
that too,
you
yeah.
have such a cooler job than me. Yeah.
Exactly. So as long as you're honest, innovation theater isn't great, but I think, again, like if you need to do the education piece of it, just be honest that you're doing that.
Right. Olivia, as someone whose corporate engagement's in your job title, and I'm guessing also in your job description, what is the role beyond capital, potentially brand equity, that a corporate can really play in the growth of a startup, right? Like if that deal doesn't happen and the corporate doesn't become a customer and doesn't invest, where else can they be explicitly helpful in the growth of that startup?
Yeah, definitely. So, for example, Dow Jones is, a giant company who has a ton of resources, access to great technology, especially in kind of the insurtech, fintech space. So they might not be a company that is going to invest in someone in our portfolio or someone in our network. They may not be a potential customer, but they are someone who has great skill set and expertise. And when you have a really early stage company, there's nothing more valuable than mentorship and support. So, if I'm two employees at a company, I have, a little bit of a beta product, but I'm still not exactly sure. I haven't found product market fit. I don't know where I'm going. If I have someone who can say, hey, we have, 500 clients that we talk to on a daily basis in the fintech and insurtech space. These are the challenges that they're having. This is the stuff that they're interested in. And you have someone who can kind of guide and support the trajectory of your product roadmap or helping you find product market fit. That's super valuable for an early stage company. So, whether it is someone to be a potential customer, I think that's great. Whether it's someone to provide mentorship, that's great. Or an investment, those are all awesome things. But for us too, building those relationships and just creating an ecosystem and feedback loop where they can learn from really industry experts is very valuable.
Anyone else want to field that?
I would say also one thing that we try to do is just give startups a good sense of what it takes to actually sell into some of these companies. So one of my goals is when I meet a really interesting startup that we think is solving a problem that's important for us to solve, I'll try to put them in front of the decision makers who have budget as soon as humanly possible, so that they can get some good feedback up front, either hey, this is actually something really interesting to us and is really relevant, depending on our current initiatives and priorities, or there are a few things that we would really need to have in place from a security perspective that is really going to need, that we absolutely need to make this viable for us to do work with. So I think getting that feedback and giving the startups a sense of what that buying process looks like, because it is very painful. It can be very painful. There's a lot of process, but helping them kind of understand what they're up against as they start selling into enterprises, if they're selling into enterprises, what that looks like.
I think these are all good points. I like to think of corporate innovators, their role, as kind of three things: catalyst, conduit, and communicator. Catalyst, you're naturally thinking about innovation on the inside of a corporation. You're also thinking about how do we engage with startups, and how do we actually take what they're doing, what we're trying to do, and make something new and interesting out of that.
Right.
So you're a catalyst for that. In terms of being a conduit, you are the entry, you're the doorway into, and the gateway into the expertise of the corporation, into commercial relationships, increasing revenue, lowering cost, increasing access. And then communicator is not something we always talk about, but is absolutely vital to making everything work in corporate innovation, especially with startup relationships, because you need to communicate with the startups and be as transparent as possible. But you also, there's kind of a day that you can't stop communicating inside. You may have messaged to senior leadership. You may have done all kinds of things. You need to have a constant program of this, giving updates, but also reminding people. It's kind of, the job is never really done on communication.
This panel is called Innovation Everywhere. Is innovation everywhere? We've talked about, and if so, how do we stop it? No, I don't. We've talked about ecosystems regionally. I think Will this morning said that New York was a unicorn by the sort of startup nomenclature definitions. how frequently, I know that we're all largely based in New York here on this panel, or at least in big hubs. How frequently are you all looking at smaller cities, smaller ecosystems to seriously engage with them?
We are always looking at smaller ecosystems. So at Acceleprise, we have kind of a venture analyst program where we want to have people in new and emerging markets to kind of get embedded in those ecosystems, understand, what types of companies are coming out of the space, what resources are available there, what kind of capital is available, how we can be supportive in those places. I was recently 2 weeks ago actually in Atlanta, which is a huge and incredible B2B SaaS ecosystem. I met with a lot of key players out there, and I think the more time that we can spend in these emerging ecosystems, the better. There is innovation everywhere. There are people who are entrepreneurs starting new companies, businesses who are interested in innovating that often just don't have access to capital or don't have access to programs and support. And the more that we can be present there, the better for the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, like for us, our mission is all about like helping entrepreneurs wherever they call home. Like we don't believe that entrepreneurs need to move to Silicon Valley or New York to be successful. And
Right.
so a big piece of what GAN does is, and that's why this network that we're creating of accelerators everywhere, not just in Silicon Valley and New York. We actually only have, I think, 2 that are based in New York City. Like we are very focused on emerging markets. And so we believe that if we bring the human and financial capital in, then they can stay where they are, right? Like they don't need to move. And so we have about 50% of our accelerators are based in the US and 50% are international. So we also work in a lot of like emerging international markets as well, which has been really interesting to see how they're figuring it out. And every culture is super different too. But I feel like there needs to be a lot of in order for an ecosystem to be healthy, there needs to be people like us, that are there and spending time there. We should talk about Atlanta because I'm curious about Atlanta. Also I was like in Madison, Wisconsin. There's things happening everywhere, and so how can we all kind of just like step in and support those entrepreneurs? Yeah.
Yeah, I think also from a corporate perspective, we want to be good participants in the cities where we have presence. So E-Trade, we have 6 major offices across the US. And so what we've done is we've found kind of, it's been a really interesting exploration actually, because I'm, from and a part of the New York City ecosystem, but getting to know the Atlanta Alpharetta area, working with Technology Association of Georgia down there, which is fabulous, or 1871 in Chicago. I can't say enough good things about them. I think there are so many interesting players, and they're so open, I think, to corporates kind of coming in and saying, we want to own this ecosystem as much as you do. We want to know how we can be helpful. We want to take responsibility for it kind of growing and continuing to succeed.
What are some of the most, in each of your recent experiences, successful, exciting outcomes of startup corporate innovation partnerships? Product launches, new business creation, anything.
I don't know if this is as exciting, but I feel really proud of it because I think it's important. So one thing that we recently put together at E-Trade is our Startup Corporate Manifesto. So it was our kind of rules for ourselves to kind of keep us in check and make sure we're doing right by the partners that we work with. And one of the things I like about it is it's very transparent, right? It forces us to take a look at ourselves and say, okay, this is a company that's doing something really cool, but do we have a use case? What does the timeline look like? Who is the business sponsor? What does the budget look like? Do we have the resources to go through the legal process, right, to even get this pilot set up? And it's not always fun to take an introspective look at yourself in the mirror and again, assess your readiness. But for us, it's helped us to be a better partner. And that's what it is at the end of the day. I think a lot of corporates will look at startups, for better or for worse, right, have the perspective and see them as vendors. Sometimes pesky vendors, sometimes disorganized vendors that don't have case studies, right? But it really does have to be a partnership, and both sides have to know what they're willing to give and what they're willing to take to make something work. And it's also okay at the end of the day to say, we're just not ready, or the interest isn't there, and you have to kind of be okay with that and be honest about it. So that's something that's been working really well for us. So again, not the most exciting collaboration, but a process that's really helped.
Yeah, manifesto is unbelievable. Very cool.
Yeah. I mean, I think for me, what I love to see is actually when when corporates internally are aligned and like know what they're doing, because then
Yeah.
it translates externally, right? So like
It happens on leap years. from
Yeah.
what I understand.
yeah, exactly. And that's kind of, that's where you see the magic happening. Like I think Tyson Foods is actually like a really good example. They have a very clear process in terms of how they work with a startup. The startup comes through the innovation department. The innovation team works with them on a pilot, and then gradually and naturally will end up probably getting investment from their fund. And so when the innovation team and the CVC side of things are actually speaking to each other and understand how they can work together, I think that's when you can create a really seamless process for the entrepreneur and be able to actually, kind of give them a roadmap of like, this is what we're going to do for year 1. This is what year 2 is going to look like. And this is, year 3, you might get an investment from us if all this stuff happens. And so, Tyson is a really good example. 3M is a really good example. BP Ventures also does it really well. So there's some out there, I think. But when you create that seamless internal process, I think that's where you start to see the magic happen.
I think piggybacking off that too, if you think about people like AB InBev or Dell Technologies Capital, they have very, structured ideas of how they're going to engage with people over the long term. And that's, I think, a great way that we see people avoiding innovation theater. If you're going to say, great, this is first going to be a strategic pilot where we're going to bring you in, get you embedded with the business. We're going to see if this can be a long-term commercial relationship, put in some resources on our end to help you scale that out. Accenture Ventures is someone who's great at that as well. And then moving kind of down the pipeline to say, great, how can we really embed you in the business to then either fund you or become a full-time customer? So I think in situations where there is a long-term framework, I'm always impressed with the returns that come from that.
I'm pleased that there are so many examples. There are so many more, and that was not always the case. So It's wonderful. I mean, it's wonderful to hear, and it's wonderful to see. Going back to some other themes that I've just been hearing here, I mean, in addition to having kind of rules of engagement, process and communication, and kind of a long-term game plan, I think having champions is something that we should also mention.
Internal
champions. We, look, with all the infrastructure we put in place, we should also still be mindful of that, because look, at the end of the day, corporations have operating businesses.
Yep.
They have profits to hit and other metrics to hit every quarter, and their own internal priorities. And so in order to make sure that your startup engagement still is working relevant and a priority inside of the corporation over the long term, those champions really can carry you down the field for a long way. So worth having.
Brilliant. This is the opportunity for anyone who has a question to ask it. Let's get some hands. We have one hand right over there. And I'm hoping to see many more. Beautiful, great. And just like that, a Hydra was born.
Hi, Ricardo from Betty. Quick question. Amazing panel, by the way. Great insights. How do you convince the corporate to really give time? Because this process takes a lot of time. And we live in accelerated life, and the corporates live even faster.
May I just applaud you on my favorite pun of the week? That was my, sorry, continue, sorry. Yeah, accelerated life, my God. John, that's in the next branding Bible. What are you doing? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, yeah.
And how do you convince the corporates to give the time? And you guys were talking about you need an internal champion, and this is a person to person typically. But what if the person leaves and the corporate changes minds? And also Jeremy from Techstars was saying that typically it takes like 5 years for them to see a return from the corporate side, that they get, okay, now I get it. And there's a return from the corporate in terms of all the effort they put on innovation with startups. So how do you convince them to put all this effort in?
Well, I would say I'm not in the business of convincing people. So there are some people who I think's head are very deep down in the sand, and it's going to take a lot of time to pull their head out. So those people I maybe am not going to spend as much time at. Maybe I'm planting some seeds, but I'm not going to spend a ton of effort. I think in the middle, too, you have people who are interested in innovation, maybe doing something internally. Maybe they have some type of CVC fund that they're working on internally. But for those people, it's really about listening. So I'm not trying to convince someone that this is going to be the greatest thing ever for your business. I want to listen to you, understand what your day-to-day looks like, what's challenging about the world of corporate innovation for you, how are you currently engaging with emerging technologies or startups. And if I'm able to listen to that person and really understand their problems, I can say, hey, I actually have something that's going to help you do that, whether it's saving time, saving money, making it easier for you. My job is I win when startups win. So if I can make you, my buyer, look great, the person who's going to engage with me on the corporate side, if I can make you look great to your boss, then I'm going to win because the startups are going to win.
May I actually try answering some of that myself real quick? So in my old life, we had a huge problem. I mean, actually, we're like incentivizing fellow executives to work with startups. Because our litmus test for success was not if a startup wins, we win. It was, how do I get a bonus? Are shareholders happy? Like it was just it was a much more sort of by the books corporate experience, and something I've seen develop as like pilots and ideas, but never actually implemented across an organization yet, at least in my awareness, is tying bonus or sort of in lieu of a bonus, another major incentive to time spent working with startups. Yeah. So the more you work with innovators, the more time you spend innovating, the better off you do by traditional corporate metrics. I just wanted to.
Yeah, in some organizations, I believe, I think it's Morgan Stanley actually now, they evaluate all employees on their annual performance reviews. Innovation is now a part of that. Brilliant. So more companies, I think, are starting to go that way. And I love what you said about innovation networks. So Pfizer has done a really great job actually creating a very formalized innovation champion network across the entire company, across the entire globe. And gentleman, Dina and I both know who used to run the program there, actually did a really great Medium blog post on how they actually did that. His name's Dan Seawald, and I'm happy to share it with anyone. But it was one of those things, because you hear people talk.
His name is Dan Seawald?
Yeah.
Oh, Seawald.
Yeah, not SeaWorld, Seawald.
Last name ever, got it, yeah.
But it's helpful because you hear people talking about, well, it's important to do something, but how do you actually go do it? How do you actually execute on that? But I think having those champion networks is so important, because if you're relying on your relationships with one or two people at the organization, the reality is the people that are drawn to corporate innovation roles can be the people that get antsy in corporations, ironically. So they're not necessarily going to be there for forever. So that's something to think about as well.
You had a question, sir.
Yeah, Mark from Innovation Centre Sunshine Coast down in Australia with the weird accent. Thank you, awesome panel. We've had some success with startup weekends, Techstar, Google startup weekends over the last 7 or 8 years, particularly engaging, well, not just obviously the main audience is the startups, but we've found that some of the younger corporates have come along and been inspired, and then they are the conduit into engaging the corporates to then connect with us, the ecosystem. And have you found startup weekends as a useful mechanism, particularly for engaging younger corporates locally here?
Yeah, so when I was at IBM, we actually did a startup weekend. And it was great. It was open to the external community, but it was also open to IBM employees. So IBM employees could participate either on a specific team working on a project, or as mentors, or even just as volunteers to get a feel for what it was all about. And it was actually so well loved that IBM decided to start their own kind of internal product competition. And so what IBM said is, we have all these kind of entrepreneurial people that are kind of popping up and saying, how do we, do more startup weekends? How do we kind of participate and embrace the entrepreneurial sides of ourselves that maybe we don't get to use in our day jobs? So IBM did just an internal company competition where people could form teams and actually build new products, where the end goal is that IBM would actually commercialize the winning one, which they did. The winning solution was an HR solution, actually, I believe, using the Watson technology. So that's, I think, maybe not necessarily answering your question as much. That's an example where Startup Weekend actually inspired us to kind of bring that more internally. But I think, too, just the general exposure for folks just gave them a sense of what even exists outside of the four walls, and gave people kind of the inspiration to go kind of seek that out themselves, even if it's not always easy and inside your four walls.
Let's get some new hands going. Yes, sir.
How you guys doing? This was a great panel. My name is Prez, and I'm from Impact. My question is, how do you mitigate the fact that so much of investment decisions are based on personal career risk? How do you remain open and keep yourself in tune with the fact that no one knows anything, and that change looks so messy and sloppy in the present, but the future often will require us to rewire the way that we think success looks like?
You know, it's a great question. I think in terms of people putting themselves on the line and saying, yes, I'm going to vote to invest in this company for this reason, it can be daunting. One thing that I've found can be particularly helpful with that is to set some kind of clear rules of engagement around what should the fund look like overall? What do we want this total portfolio to look like? And if things we believe fit well into the portfolio, then we have some structure around making decisions. It's not, a case by case. It takes the personal equation more out of it. I do think, though, to your point, there's a lot of risk. It's very messy when doing early stage startup investing. I mean, there's really no way to get out of that, right? And so you do need to find people that are willing to embrace the uncertainty and the risk. And it kind of comes back to just kind of getting behind a particular company and saying, yes, we have this structure and we're going to make decisions in, an unbiased way as possible. But yes, I'm willing to, be uncomfortable, get out there, make this decision, and then support my own decision on a go-forward basis. You can think about it as de-risking your own investments if you're contributing to the success of the company in the future. And so if you're encountering people that are maybe hesitant from that matter, invite them in to be a supporter and a sponsor of everything that you're doing, because they can have an impact on the success in the future.
2 more questions right over here. Gentleman in the flannel. Then we'll come right over there.
So the 3 C's that Deborah mentioned earlier, the third C probably gets the least attention. And I don't know exactly what my question is, but communication is, I don't know anybody who communicates that well except maybe Matt. So how do you work on that? How do you figure that out? Is there a great book on the for this ecosystem, what is communication and how do you define it, and what are best practices and where do you look for them, and any thoughts?
So I think it depends. Do you mean internally or externally? Are you, Right. I think manifesto, is a really good first step, right? Understanding as a corporate, what are the ways that you are holding yourself accountable to communicating to startups. I think, like I said, being really, really upfront with what your intentions are, is crucial. But I also think the startup needs to be able to communicate well too, right? I think startups get really excited and get caught up in their vision and the passion of what they're working on, which is so great, and that's why we all love them. But a lot of the times, I think it can lead people down the wrong road, especially when they're at such an early stage and they still don't have necessarily a viable product. I think being really open and honest, that's all it goes down to, and setting expectations early. If you set the expectation early, it's better to surprise people later on than to disappoint them, right? So set that expectation, and then and that's how I think is a one key thing of being able to communicate better. At least that's how I see it.
And on the accelerator side too, something to think about is how you're measuring the impact of the introductions or relationships that you're facilitating. So if you can say, great, I can introduce you X startup to 50 corporations that may or may not be interested in working with you, and that is defining success for me, versus saying, what is the impact of those introductions? If I have 50 companies, I know, hey, the threshold for you to even talk to someone or even be considered in, a conversation with them is that you need to be doing X number of dollars in revenue. You need to have worked with this level of client before. You need to have these legal, this insurance, whatever. If I'm able to kind of be the Sherpa in between those two groups and helping to facilitate that communication, I know, IBM actually only works with companies that are doing $3 million in ARR. And so right now, this introduction is not going to be relevant for you, and making sure that you have someone who is a little more unbiased as the Sherpa, who's kind of connecting those two groups.
We got one more question in the back. We have no more question time? Okay, one more question. You know what? Okay, go for it.
I just want to say that I used to work for an institution where this was rare. So thank you very much for an all-women panel. And on that, can you tell me or tell us, how does it look, the corporate innovation space for women? Is it a safer bet for your energy and insights, or is it still tricky?
I've actually found the corporate innovation community to be pretty diverse in terms of genders, ages, races even. And I think one of the things that's so interesting is you see a lot of corporates, right, that compete with different products within different industries, but corporate innovators tend to be very open to kind of sharing best practices and learning from each other. I think we were just talking about this last night with someone, how it can be a little bit of an isolating function within your company sometimes. And so I think we tend to kind of seek out each other at different organizations. And I think just in terms of the types of people that corporate innovation is attracting, sometimes you have the folks that are, previously entrepreneurs and want to go to the other side. You have folks that are interested, have been at one company for a really long time and want to be change agents and actually enact the change that they want to see. You get people with all different types of experiences, which has been really interesting to me. I personally love being in this space. It's been a new experience, and there's been a lot of women.
Unless one of you wants to jump on the other end of that, I'm so sorry. I do want to get to all those other questions, and I think we'll have some time to do some one-on-ones if that's all right. But we have been given the hook, and it's because it's lunchtime. So this is a potentially extremely exciting moment where you can all replenish yourselves and get ready for the rest of the day, and then we'll come back and do all the other exciting content for the afternoon.